Have you noticed that life has tough questions at times? You've probably heard this saying, that if you want to ruin the holidays, talk about religion and politics. Today we're going to do both. You're welcome. So that's just what we are. It's like I told you, it's like everything else. When we come across it in the Bible, I have to talk about it. I don't have to like it, but I got to talk about it. And if you're uncomfortable, that's okay. Take it up with Jesus. He said it. He recorded it. I'm just doing what he told me to do. But here's the backdrop. You have the Pharisees, and you have the Sadducees, and the religious leaders of the day, and they've come to the conclusion that they're just done with Jesus. He's kind of ruffled their feathers long enough, and so what they want to do is they want to silence him. And here's their plan. Let's try to trap him by asking a series of questions, and they're going to ask him political, religious, and theological questions. So I obviously asked myself, why would they do that? Why was that their plan? Couldn't they have come up with some other plan? No, that's where they were. But here's why. Their thought was that if he answers these questions wrong, he traps himself. And in their limited thinking, they're like, well, there's no way he could answer any of these questions correctly. And so we've got him. They think they have a foolproof plan. Well, what we'll see today is they did not have a foolproof plan. But God had another plan in place, and they were actually just playing into a bigger picture. And it was this, that God had something different in mind. They were actually going to be fulfilling the scriptures. What they were going to fulfill was Exodus chapter 12, where it talks about the Passover lamb, how that 5 days before the Passover, the lamb would have to go and be examined by the high priest and everybody to make sure it was without spot or without blemish. We just so happen to be 5 days out from the crucifixion, or 5 days out from Passover, where Jesus himself would become our Passover lamb. And so they think what they're doing is catching and tricking Jesus, when in reality what they're doing is they're fulfilling what the Bible said needed to take place in examining the Passover lamb before it was slaughtered to be sacrificed for the sins of the people. Kind of funny how that works, isn't it? They thought, oh, I got him, but they don't. He went under, Jesus is going to go under this examination by the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, and the Herodians. But this puts us 5 days from the cross. And I just wonder what Jesus was thinking. Less than a week, and he would be brutally beaten, rejected, spit upon, and crucified. I wonder if he had enough of these people when they were asking him these questions. I just wonder what went through his head. Because we know he was both fully God, but yet fully man at the same time. Anyway, today what we're going to see is how Jesus' examination answers life's tough questions. And the first one, right off the bat, they ease into it like, what's your favorite color, right? It's the political question. Chapter 22, verse 15. And when the Pharisees went and plotted how they might entangle him in his talk, and they sent to him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true, and teach the way of God in truth, nor do you care about anyone, for you do not regard the persons of men. Tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? All right, before we address that question, you have the Pharisees and the Herodians. Here's what we know about these two groups of people. They did not like each other. They weren't BFFs. They weren't hanging out. They weren't going to game night. They definitely weren't going to eat nachos after church together. I'm just saying, that's not what they were going to do. But yet they could come together with one common goal, to try to trap Jesus. It's interesting how that works. The Pharisees, it means a separated one, right? They were separated. They kind of elevated themselves. And what separated them was their belief of the oral and the written law of Moses, how they kind of adhered to that and how they promoted that. They held it in great reverence. They held to the traditions and their interpretations. They even elevated the oral laws to the same level as the written law, and maybe even sometimes above that. And they were the ones that would carry that out. And then you have the Herdonians, and they were a religious group with political ambitions, probably more political than religious. They were Jews who attached themselves to the political fortunes of the Herdonian family, hoping to promote the interest of the Jewish people. We know that they were liberal in observing Jewish rituals, and they opposed the Pharisees. But yet here they are working together. And they come to Jesus and they ask him a political question. Is it lawful to pay taxes? Now, the tax that they're referring to here is what is called the poll tax. And it was one that the Pharisees hated, but the Herdonians embraced it. But here's my thought. What a perfect place to start if you want to stir the pot, isn't it? Who loves to pay taxes? I mean, how many of you have April 15th mark on your calendar as the greatest day of the year? No. How many of you despise that day? That's not the best day of the year. And so why did the Pharisees oppose the poll tax? Well, there were several reasons. Here's a few. Number one, they didn't want to submit to a Gentile power. They didn't want to submit to the Roman leadership or to Caesar. The Romans elevated Caesar to divinity, and they thought he was a god. He tried to tell everybody he was a god, and they didn't want to join in that false idol worship. But, sometimes I think we just complex things too much. I think they were a lot like us. There's just a lot better things I could spend my money on. That's what I think. I think they're like, dude, why would I want to give them my money? I could use it. There's a lot of more things that I would like to spend it on. Now we have the Herdonians. They were the party that supported Herod, and they favored this tax. They were pro this tax. They liked it. Caesar gave Herod authority, and it would be difficult to stay in power without Roman support, and they knew that. And so if they were going to accomplish their cause, they needed to have some backing. And so it's easy to see why these two, the Pharisees and the Herdonians, used this poll tax as their trap, because no matter what Jesus would have said or how he answered, he would seemingly create a problem for himself. If he opposed the tax, he's in trouble with Rome. If he encouraged it, he was in trouble with the Jews. We've got him. They got it figured out. But I love Jesus' response, because his reply shows that kingdom living should impact our earthly residency. He's going to address it. But notice how he does. In verse 18, it says, but Jesus perceived their wickedness. He knew what they were doing. And he said, why do you test me, you hypocrite? Show me the money. Oh, show me the tax money, sorry. But so they brought him a denarius, and he said to them, whose image and inscription is this? They said to him, Caesar's. And he said to them, render therefore to Caesar's the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. When they heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way. Jesus revealed the heart of the guys questioning him. You're hypocrites. That's what he said. He says, you don't have pure motives. You're trying to trip me. You're trying to trap me. What were they? They were people trying to present themselves in such a way that people would think of them highly, higher than they should have been thought. Jesus' response is genius. Give me a coin. Give me a coin, he says. The reason he said that is because each ruler, when they would take over, what they did is they had new coins minted, and they had their image placed on that coin. And so this denarius had Caesar's image, and so Jesus says, give back to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Whose picture's on it? Belongs to him. Give it to him. But he doesn't stop there. He says, but give to God that which is God's. He's referring to the image of the coin. We are image bearers of Christ. We were made in the image and likeness of God. And so what Jesus is saying is, give Caesar the money, but give God your life. Give God your heart. You are an image bearer. Give back to God that which is rightfully his. Give him the thing where his image is imprinted on. I've had opportunities to do memorial services of people that I didn't know. And sometimes that's hard. Like I said, we just had my mom's last week. And it was nice because the pastor knew my mom, and so it just made it just that much more personal. And people always ask me, well, how is it that you could do a memorial service for somebody you don't know? And this is kind of where I find myself. As everybody is created in the image and likeness of God. So when I listen to the family tell me about their loved one who passed away, I'm looking for images of who Jesus is. Now, I'm not going to lie to them. Like, you've all been to that memorial where, you know, the guy who's talking about the guy who passed away is definitely talking about somebody different. I'm not going to be that guy, you know, but I can speak truthfully and say how their life was a snapshot in certain areas of who Jesus is. We can learn about his character, his nature, his image. So what do we learn from this first question? Number one, our lives must first reflect God's image. Caesar was not God, and neither are our leaders today. Two, we know that Christians are to honor and obey and pray for our rulers. That's what the Bible tells us. Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, 1 Timothy 2. We should be praying for them. We should honor them. We should obey them. We need to give to Caesar what is Caesar's. But number three, we need to remember that Christians have dual citizenship in heaven and here on the earth. We live in what is described as in between the already and the not yet, the already of our redemption, but the not yet of eternity, where we will be with Jesus, where every tear will be wiped away. So how do we live this way? Well, if you haven't figured it out, my math could be wrong, because I can only count to 20 if I have my shoes off. I believe there's 38 days until the election. I did my best math. 38 days. If I'm wrong, forgive me, but it's close enough. Here's the bottom line. You and I have been given an opportunity just for the sheer fact that we've been born in this country to have a voice. We have a voice. So, as that is being a reality, you need to know that you've been given a voice that prays for our leaders, prays for those who are over us. May not like them. Can't choose which ones you can pray for and not pray for. You got to pray for them all. The good, the bad, and the whatevers. You got to pray for them. Why would God tell us that? I believe it's pretty simple. Because I believe what God wants you to know is that you can make a difference. That praying for people makes a difference. Praying is what changes people's lives and changes hearts. But you got to be educated. You got to know what you're praying for. You got to know what you're praying about. So you got to do your research. I found this great tool for this season we find ourselves in. You've heard me talk about the pour over. It's how I get my news. I get it 3 days a week. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Love it. I can read it, be done with it in about 7 minutes. And that's it. And I love it because it hits all the topics. At first I thought, how could you get the vast scope of the news in Monday, Wednesday, Friday? But man, it's great. Well, they're doing a thing now leading up to the election where they give you a biblical perspective of everything that's going through. And so I would encourage you, go to thepourover.org, sign up, and get that. Do your research. Pray for our leaders. Pray, pray, pray. The other thing that we're going to do as a church is on Tuesday, the day of the election, the church is going to be open. We're going to have worship music playing. We're going to have communion. I invite you guys to come and pray. Bring your ballot. Pray over it. What a great opportunity. Get your mind and your heart right before you go to the polls. We've been commanded to pray. Take communion. Remember that Jesus died even for politicians. But the bottom line is this. How do we live for a different king in a different kingdom? We've been saying that a lot through the book of Matthew. And it hit me this week. It's by having our voice sound like Jesus's. Saying the things that he would say, praying the things that he would pray. Having our voice sound like Jesus's. Now for the next question. The religious questions, verse 23. The same day, the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him and asking him, saying, Teacher, Moses said that if a man dies having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were with us 7 brothers. The first died after he had married, and having no offspring, left the wife to his brother. Likewise, the second also, and the third, even to the 7th. Last of all, the woman died also. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For they all had her. Jesus answered and said to them, You are mistaken, not knowing the scripture nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God in heaven. But concerning the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what is spoken by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And when the multitude heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. So the Sadducees now show up, and they ask the religious question, because we're told they didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in the spirit world. They trusted the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And so they often challenged the Pharisees, saying, hey, you guys say you believe in the resurrection. Prove it through the Torah. Show us in the Torah how there is a resurrection. But the Pharisees were unable to do so successfully. And so now the Sadducees show up to Jesus with this hypothetical question based on what is called the law of the Levirate marriage. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10, it stated that if a man was married to a woman and he dies, but they have no children, to carry out the family name, it was passed from brother to brother until they have children. So they've got it all figured out. Let's strap him. Let's figure out whose wife she is. Sounds like a TV show, doesn't it? Don't you? I mean, I can almost see it. I probably shouldn't say it, because now we're going to find there's going to be this reality TV show. All right. Anyway. Now, the word Levirate, it's a Latin word, lever, meaning a husband's brother. It absolutely has nothing to do with the tribe of Levi. It just simply means a husband's brother. And again, the purpose of this custom was to preserve a man's name should he die without a male heir. And so we know that in a nation where family inheritance was significant, like it was back then, it was important for each home to have an heir so they could pass things down. It was considered a disgrace if you were a man and you refused to raise up for your brother a child. It was a disgrace. And so Jesus then says this, you guys think you know the scriptures. That's what they based everything on, right? Show us in the Torah, which would have been the scripture for them. Show us in the Torah how the resurrection is real. And so he addresses the issue. You don't know the scriptures, he says, or the power of God. What was he inferring? You don't know God. You don't know the God you think you know. And then he goes on and he says, when you're in heaven, it's not going to be like here. He says, you're going to be like the angels. And some people freak out and they're like, oh, see, we're going to become angels and we're going to get wings. I don't want to be an angel because I know which angel I'd be. I'd be the short, fat one, the fluffy one. Like that's the one I would be that sits on a cloud eating nachos. That would be me. I don't want to be that one. I want a sword. I'm just saying. Anyway, he said they would be like angels, meaning sexless and not given in marriage and not married. But then it's interesting because he gets to the root of the matter. And he answers the question they weren't asking, but that they were asking the Pharisees to describe, and that was to use the Torah to show how the resurrection is real, that we could trust in the resurrection. And so he quotes now Exodus 3:6, which is, Genesis, Exodus, that's the second book of the 5. So he goes to the Torah and he says this. God says to Moses, the guy that they elevate, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Notice that he didn't say, I was. So just in using the terminology, I am, it proves to them that they are still alive, even though they've died. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what do we learn from this question? We learn that God is with us. God is with us because he's the God of the living and not the dead. And the last time I checked, we're all alive. Right now, we're alive. So he's with us. If that's the case, we don't have to lose hope. That's what I love about this. Jesus is with us. Now we come to the third question. And this is the question that everybody likes to ask. And it's the greatest question. Who's the greatest, right? But when the Pharisees heard that he silenced the Sadducees, I just picture them smiling. Ha ha, he got you, They gathered together. Then one of them, a lawyer, of course it was a lawyer. Any lawyers in the house? Sorry, I love you, but the lawyer showed up and asked him the question, testing him, saying, Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. I would encourage you, if you have a Bible, a physical Bible, underline that phrase, verse 40, circle it, put a star by it, because I think it's really important. I'm hoping to give you something to encourage you today about that phrase. And so, which is the greatest? It wasn't and isn't a new question. The scribes debated it for centuries, and we're still doing it today. Which one is the best? This stems from the fact that the Pharisees had documented that there was more than just 10 commandments. There were actually 613 commandments in the Old Testament. Okay? Or actually, in the law, there were 613. 248 were positive, 365 negative. Interesting. There's definitely a negative comment for every day, right? I mean, we can always find something negative. I just realized that, by the way. It was just like, to make it easier, what these guys did is they divided the commandments into what they called the heavy ones, or the important ones, and then there were the light ones. There were the commandment lights, and those were the unimportant ones. And what they were trying to do is get people to focus on the heavier of the commandments, the more weightier commandments, and not to worry so much about the light ones. So it's like, what are they doing? They're trying to make it easy. But yet, they can confuse things. And so they said, which is the greatest commandment? Which of the 613 do we need to really keep? Just give me one. That's all I can do. You ever felt like that? I get one and I still can't do it. But one, Jesus is so amazing in how he responds. He quotes from Deuteronomy 6:4, which is known as the Shema. And it was a statement of faith recited daily by every Orthodox Jew. So that he uses their own language, things that they were accustomed to saying, to answer the question. He says the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. That's what he says. Start there. Love God with your heart, soul, and mind, and all your strength. Love him with everything that you are. You see, to love God is not to just have good feelings about him. True love involves the will and the heart as well. It's more than just good vibes. It's more than Jesus just being my homeboy. Like it's saying there's a depth to this love that I have. There's a depth to my commitment. But you cannot separate the love from God and the love from your neighbor. That's what Jesus is going to show us here by quoting from Leviticus 19:18. And what he's doing is he's taking that and he's putting those two on the same level. The thing that Orthodox Jews repeated every day, he says, let me show you. It's not just about loving God, but you also got to love your neighbor as yourself. You got to love God, you got to love others. And then he says, all of the law and the prophets hang on both of these commandments. In other words, the first and the second commandment must be linked. You cannot separate them. You got to have them go together. You can't have one without the other. That's the extent of my singing abilities. But all of these things hang on the law and the prophets. What does that mean? And this is what's fascinating to me. If you think about it, if you're going to love God first and you look upward, you're going vertical, right? So I got to love God. But if I got to love others, I got to look to my left and I got to look to my right. So if I'm going to love God, I'm going to look up, and then I'm going to look to my right, your left, and my right. And we're told that on this hangs the law and the prophets. 5 days from now, Jesus would illustrate what loving God and loving others look like as he hung on the cross. What do we learn from this question? It's love that holds things together. It's the love that Jesus demonstrated on the cross as he loved the Father and he loved others. And so now what we've seen is Jesus has answered 3 difficult questions. He's dealt with relationships between religion and government, this life and the afterlife, and God and our neighbors. But there's one more question, and Jesus is the one that asks it. And this is the most important question. And I believe it's the question that he's asking us today to really consider. Verse 41, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, what do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? They said to him, the son of David. He said to them, how then does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son? And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day on did anyone dare question him anymore. Jesus asked the disciples, who do men say that I am? This is another form of that, but not asked to his disciples who had been following him, but asked of the religious leaders who should have known him and should have known the answer to this question. Whose son is the Christ? You see, experts of the law knew the answer would have been, well, he's the son of David. He's David's son, the great king, the king that we all love, the king that we esteem. But then Jesus uses Psalm 110:1, and he asks the second question. If the Messiah is David's son, then how could the Messiah also be David's Lord? So if he's a son, how could he be the Lord? How does that work? The answer is, as God, the Messiah, is David's Lord, as man, he was David's son. Because we know what about Jesus? He was fully man and fully God. He added to his divinity his humanity, becoming both the fulfillment of this, the Son and the Lord. You see, Jesus is both the root and the offspring of David. That's what Revelation chapter 22, verse 16 tells us. The scholars of that day were so confused about the Messiah because it seemed to contradict itself in the scriptures. And so they would see pictures of him in the Old Testament, and yet they couldn't reconcile it because they would see this suffering servant when they were hoping for a conquering king. which they saw that there was going to be a conquering king as well. And so they're confused. They asked themselves this question: were there two Messiahs? How is it that God's servant could suffer and die and yet reign? Doesn't seem to make sense. But had they listened to Jesus, what they would have learned is that there's only one Messiah. He was both human and divine, and he was there in their midst. He would suffer and he would die as a sacrifice for the sins. They would see that in 5 days. They would see the servant described in Isaiah 53 coming out right in front of them. But 3 days later, he would raise from the dead in triumph, eventually ascend into heaven where he will come back as a conquering king. You see, what's so amazing to me is that what we can learn from these religious leaders is that they had their own ideas and they weren't willing to listen to anything else. They really didn't want change. And yet, that's what I see all around us. We're comfortable with what we don't know, but we don't want to change enough to know the truth. And Jesus is asking the most important question: who do you say that I am? We know who the Pharisees thought. They were confused. We know what the disciples thought because it was recorded. But that was then. Now it's today. Well, and if he's asking you that question, how are you going to answer? Do you want to change? How you answer that question will make all the difference in the world. You see, if they had accepted his teaching, they would have also accepted him as the Messiah, repented of their sins, and followed him. But they were unwilling to do so. And the consequence, the result of their actions and their rejection, was that dialogue with Jesus stopped. They stopped talking to him. And we're told that no more would they ask him any questions. Why did they not ask any more questions? I believe it's not because they believe the truth. I believe it's because they were afraid to face the truth. So what truth can we learn from this question and from these other questions? How do we tie it all together? How do we put a bow on it? I'll leave you with this last thought, and it's truly my last thought because I can smell the cheese. On the throne in heaven sits our suffering servant king, who loves us and who rose from the dead to empower us to live for a different king and kingdom as we live in the in-between of the already and not yet of our coming Messiah. Giving us the ability, as we wait, to have our voice sound like Jesus's.